Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what's Bootstrap from what you have seen in there. So here is the original one and how you can get started on that. You can get to this page on that URL directly. The way I always like doing finding it, as I showed you before, just search for Bootstrap or something like that. That should take you to this page. And then from there, when you start reading the docs, it should take you to the Get Started, the introduction. And then this shows you how you can start using Bootstrap on your projects. The whole idea is that you have to include like an HTML template. As you can see in here, this will be like your regular page. And appending Bootstrap to that will be something, let me make this bigger, like just appending two main elements. Like one is the CSS component. And as you can see, it includes this attribute for integrity, which actually it's checking that there haven't been any changes on the file between the moment it is being distributed on the CDN and the moment that it's being downloaded on the browser for the actual client. A CDN is a content delivery network, which is basically specific server that it's supposed to be very close to the client in a sense that it could be serve pages faster. So you can use those for these common libraries like this. And eventually, if you create a larger application, you want to distribute it with a CDN so it gets distributed faster. So there are basically two elements that you have to load. One is the CSS, as you can see in here. Remember that if you load things on the head of your document, they're going to be regularly loaded before the page is rendered. And since this is going to control how the whole page looks like, we want that. And then this is where I usually like loading my JavaScript, which is right before the end of the body tag. When you put it like that, the page will first render, which is going to get you time, and then it can go and display and load all of the libraries. You can also manually choose if you wanna like if you're not going to be using any of the specific JavaScript elements, then you don't need the second part. But then there's also another option where you can just split the library and then have one of the requirements they have for pop-ups, which is popper.js, be loaded manually. Take into account that there are a lot of people are not using Bootstrap anymore because it's kind of have this old concept of creating these large bundles that can be too big for different pages. And if that you're worried about something like that, there is take a look at all of this documentation, especially here on the customize, where you can select only to include the parts that you want. Okay, there are other libraries nowadays that are trying to be more lightweight, but I still prefer Bootstrap overall. Um, then, having said that, the main part of Bootstrap, which is kind of like the main reason why I started using it and I still recommend it, it's the whole grid system. So the grid system in Bootstrap, it's one way in which you can distribute the space that you have on your page into different columns. Like for instance, if you take the whole home page that they have in here, and if you imagine that all of this is like 12 columns or something like that, then I want to say that this could be something like 8 columns or something, and then this could be 2 columns, and there's 2 other columns in here, or maybe 10, and then one and one on each side. So the whole idea is that you can distribute it like as a whole, or you can just start creating different columns like this, and everything has to be included in a container class. And then once you do that, then you can start defining like each one of the elements, how many columns are going to take. The other thing is that each one of those elements is going to have different sizes that you can control. I'm going to show you that in another example. And then here it's how you can start playing with it. If you want them to have like equal height, if you want them to expand or not. Usually the documentation for Bootstrap is going to be more of a reference on showing like everything that is possible rather than walking you by it. So be aware of that. Here are some other examples where they're loading just like 2 columns on one side and then the other one with a regular one. And then, for instance, this one with variable width, which is actually adjusting, and etc., etc. Here is another example, like this is the normal way that I tend to use it. is that you go and define, as I said, imagine that you have 12 as your total number of columns, and then you create those between rows. I'm going to show you that in an example. And then every row is going to have 12 columns, and then you decide how many of those you want to get. However, if you only want to start like appending more columns, and if you do it like just with call, it is going to be distributing equally, okay? So that is for the grid system. Now, if you want to see different examples on how to use Bootstrap, you can go into the example pages, and then here are all of the different starters that you can use. And then all over here, you can have like many different basic examples. Like for instance, this is including different heroes. And then if you just take a look at how the page was built, if you just right click and inspect, then this can gives you an idea on how it is being created. And you can just copy this part, and basically you will get something similar to that, okay? There is a bunch of examples that you can see in there, especially the ones that have, like here, for instance, with a more complete grid are the ones that I like getting started with. But you also have another option, which is to use different templates. If you want to go with something more advanced, although at this level, I strongly recommend you to go and try to create everything on your own. So that way you can make sure that you're learning more. Like remember that nowadays we can generate a lot of code using generative AI, but the way that you can learn better is just by doing yourself. Now, if you see something in here that's very interesting to you, you can go and take a look at how the code of that was built, and then try to replicate it on your own. But if you want to use templates, at least for the first project, you can do that. It's up to you. Okay. Now, having the grid system, the other thing that you use with Bootstrap are different components. So if you go down here on the component side, you have all of these ones in here that you can start adding. And that's what differentiate Bootstrap from other libraries, like for instance, Tailwind or something like that, which describes things more on, I create a div and then I append like certain features to it. In here is more like a component where I can go and reuse different elements in different parts. So one of the most basic ones that you can have is like different buttons. As you can see, all of these buttons. And then the way you create it is that you use the regular HTML button, but then you start appending certain classes that are specific to Bootstrap. And then in this case, I'm saying this is going to be a button, and that button is going to be a primary button, and that's going to be this one. This is the secondary, the success, the danger, and all of that. You can also configure like all of these colors, but normally those are the default ones when you don't change those elements. Now, having said that, and one thing I really like from Bootstrap is that it has a lot of these accessibility tips already embedded in the library, which really helps, especially later in the semester, you're going to see that they really help. So take a look at the different ones that you have in here. I am constantly adding, like for instance, nav bars are one of the ones that I use a lot. But there's also other elements like spinners or like drop downs, and for instance, this one requires the JavaScript library. And like cards, it's another one that is very commonly used. Accordions and all of these different elements. So just take a look at that. And then the good news in here is that you always just can copy this code and then append it to your page. Now, I mean, say that like that's going to be like for all the components, but then like the other one that you can also see that has like a very interesting documentation is the forms. So basically, now that you understand how to use different elements, you can combine them into forms, and which are basically like, think of them as like an aggregation of different elements from things that I want to capture from the user. Like the typical one, it's like I want to get like an email address and a password. So I enter something like this. And basically it's just an organization of putting a form, and then again combining different elements, like for instance label and an input, and all of them just using the corresponding classes from that. So usually the way you start using this is just copying and pasting code and then modifying the parts that affect you. You have like a full documentation in here, Again, I could spend hours just speaking about each one of those, but the only way that you're going to learn this is by doing it on your own and start adding things when you need them. I'm still going to give you an example from the Airbnb dataset that I gave you before, but for the moment, just make sure that you go and read all of that documentation, okay?